Jake's hands trembled as he clutched the broken watch. His eyes flicked to the door as it slammed behind Mark. "You think this is easy for me?" Mark's voice was low, tense, but heavy with exhaustion. Jake didn't respond. He stared at the cracked pavement, the weight of his father's words pressing down like the summer heat. Mark stepped closer, the wooden stick in his hand heavy and threatening. "This is your last warning, Jake. You keep messing up, and I won't be here to catch you next time." Jake finally met his father's eyes, defiance mixed with a desperate plea. "I'm trying," Jake whispered, voice cracking. Mark shook his head, frustration boiling over. "Trying isn't enough. Not anymore." Silence fell. Outside, the city buzzed on, unaware of the fracture growing between father and son. The kitchen was silent, except for the low hum of the fridge and the dull scraping sound as Jake dragged his spoon through a plate of cold beans. He wasn't really hungry. He just didn't want to hear his stomach growl again. Mark sat across the table, nursing a cup of black coffee like it held all the answers. He hadn't touched his plate either. The tension between them was thick, heavier than the heat hanging in the air. "You skipped school again," Mark said quietly, not looking up. Jake shrugged without lifting his eyes. "Didn't feel like going." Mark's jaw clenched. "You think life waits for how you feel?" Still, Jake didn't answer. He just kept dragging the spoon in slow circles. His shoulders were hunched, worn down. Not from laziness, but from something deeper. Something Mark couldn't, or wouldn't, see. "I work 12 hours, come home dead tired, and I still try to hold this house together," Mark muttered. "And you just throw it all away." Jake's hands balled into fists on the table. "You think I want to live like this? You think this is easy for me?" Mark finally looked up, their eyes locking across the table. Two men from different worlds, trapped in the same broken space. For a long second, neither spoke. Then Jake stood, leaving the plate untouched, and walked to his room without another word. Mark leaned back and let out a long breath, staring into the empty seat. Jake lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The light from a street lamp slipped through the cracked blinds, painting dull orange lines across the walls. His hands rested behind his head, but his mind was racing. The walls were thin. From his room, he could hear Mark pacing again, murmuring to himself, angry, tired, or maybe just lost. Jake shut his eyes tight, hoping sleep would come, but the weight inside him was too loud. Every word Mark had said at the table kept echoing in his head. Throwing it all away. A soft knock came at the door. Jake didn't answer. Mark pushed it open anyway and stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He looked at his son for a long moment. "When your mom left," Mark began, his voice low, "I promised her I'd do better. That I'd take care of you." Jake turned his head toward the wall. "Then why does it feel like I'm the one raising myself?" Mark swallowed hard. "You think I don't care, but I do. I just don't know how to show it sometimes." Jake didn't speak. His silence wasn't defiance, it was exhaustion. Mark looked down, then quietly closed the door behind him. In the dark, Jake whispered to no one, "I wish she took me with her." Saturday morning crept in with gray skies and the sound of car horns outside. Jake sat on the porch steps again, hoodie pulled over his head, watching the neighbors argue across the street. Kids played on the sidewalk. A dog barked at nothing. Mark stood inside by the window, watching Jake from behind the curtain. He had planned to take Jake out, maybe get some breakfast, try to talk. But something in him hesitated. They drifted so far, and he didn't know how to bridge the gap without messing it up. He stepped outside anyway, hands in his pockets. "You eat yet?" he asked. Jake didn't turn around. "I'm good." Mark sat beside him slowly. For a while, neither spoke. Just sat there, listening to the buzz of the street. "I used to sit here with your mom," Mark said softly. "Right on these steps. She always made things feel lighter, even when they weren't." Jake's fingers tapped against his knee. "Why'd she leave?" Mark exhaled. "We broke each other in ways we didn't know how to fix." Jake looked at his father, his face hard but his voice low. "And now you're breaking me too." Mark froze. Jake stood, pulling his hoodie tighter. "I'm going for a walk." Mark watched him go, the weight of everything unsaid dragging behind him like a shadow. Jake wandered through the neighborhood, his hands in his pockets, his head low. The cracked sidewalks and boarded-up stores felt more familiar than home did lately. He passed the corner store where Mr. Alonso always nodded at him but never smiled. He passed the bus stop where older teens smoked and stared like they could see right through him. And then he kept walking, further than usual. It wasn't until he reached the underpass that he realized he had no idea why he was still walking. "Yo, you lost?" a voice called from behind. Jake turned. 3 older boys leaned against a wall, one of them tossing a basketball between his hands. They looked him up and down. "Nah, just walking," Jake replied, trying to sound calm. One of the guys stepped forward. "You don't look from around here. What school you go to?" Jake shrugged. "Don't matter." The tension was thin and sharp. Jake could feel his chest tighten. "Relax," the guy laughed. "We just messin' with you. But watch where you wander. Not every street's friendly." Jake nodded, then kept walking, his pace a little faster now. He didn't stop until he was blocks away, leaning on a streetlight pole, trying to slow his breathing. For the first time in a long time, he wished his dad had stopped him before he left the house. The front door creaked open just past sunset. Mark was at the kitchen table, same spot as always, elbows on the wood, staring at the clock like it owed him an explanation. Jake stepped in slowly, trying to slip past unnoticed. "Where you been?" Mark's voice came low but sharp. Jake froze. "Just walking." "For 5 hours?" Jake didn't answer. Mark stood. "I thought something happened. I was 2 seconds from calling." "You never call," Jake snapped. "You just wait for me to mess up." The words hit hard. Mark's face twitched, caught between anger and hurt. "I don't know how to reach you anymore, Jake. You don't talk. You don't care." Jake dropped his bag on the floor. "That's because you only talk when you're mad. You only care when I'm gone." Silence. Jake's voice cracked. "I walked into a bad street today, Dad. I could have gotten hurt. And for a second, I kinda didn't care." Mark's eyes widened. Jake turned away, walking to his room. Mark stood frozen, hearing that sentence play again in his head. And for the first time in years, he didn't just feel like a father failing his kid, he felt like a man who never learned how to love properly. That night, Mark sat alone in the living room, an untouched cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The TV flickered, but the sound was off. He wasn't watching. He was remembering. On the coffee table sat a worn-out notebook, one of the few things left behind when Jake's mom walked out the door. Mark flipped it open slowly. Between old grocery lists and scribbled reminders were pages of half-written letters. Letters he had started to write to Jake over the years but never finished. Never gave. "Dear Jake, today you asked why I work so late. I wanted to tell you it's because I want to give you everything I never had." He paused. "Dear Jake, I know I yell too much. I don't mean to. I just get scared. Scared you'll leave me like she did." Mark swallowed hard and shut the notebook. Upstairs, Jake was wide awake too. He stared at the ceiling again, but this time with silent tears sliding down both cheeks. His heart hurt in a way he couldn't explain. The world outside didn't feel safe. But neither did the world inside his own house. And somehow, both of them, father and son, were crying alone in the same home, just 1 floor apart. Sunday morning came with silence. No yelling. No footsteps. Just the low hum of city life creeping in through cracked windows. Mark stood in the kitchen frying eggs, trying to pretend things were normal, like cooking could fix the cracks between them. Jake hadn't come down yet, and part of him thought maybe he wouldn't. Then the phone rang. "Hello." Mark answered, wiping his hand on a towel. "Mr. Reynolds? This is Officer Daniels. There's been an incident. It's about Jake." Mark's heart stopped. "We found him near Lincoln Park," the officer continued. "He wasn't hurt, but he was involved in a scuffle. He wouldn't talk, just kept asking us to call you." Mark's grip tightened on the counter. "I'm on my way." By the time he got to the station, Jake was sitting alone in a small waiting room, hoodie up, scuffed shoes tapping nervously. His eyes widened when he saw his dad, not in fear, but in surprise. Mark knelt down in front of him. "You okay?" Jake looked away. I'm not who you think I am. Mark's voice softened. You're my son. That's all I know. And I should have been there sooner. Jake's lip quivered, but he held it back. For the first time, they saw each other, not as enemies, but as two broken pieces of the same life, trying to find their way back. The drive home was quiet, not tense, but heavy with the weight of things left unsaid for too long. Jake stared out the window, and Mark kept glancing over, wanting to speak, unsure how to begin. Halfway home, Mark pulled over. Come on, he said. Jake looked confused. What? Let's walk. They got out near an old basketball court where Mark used to take Jake when he was younger. It was empty now, just cracked pavement and a rusty hoop. Mark sat on the bench. Jake followed. I wasn't there when you needed me, Mark began. Not really. I showed up with rules, not reasons. With punishments, not patience. Jake stayed silent, listening. I thought if I made you tough, you'd survive this world better than I did. But all I did was push you away. Jake turned toward him, voice low. You were angry all the time. Mark nodded. Yeah, because I was scared. Scared of being a bad father. And I became one anyway. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Jake whispered, I thought you hated me. Mark's eyes welled up. Never. I just didn't know how to love you right. Jake leaned forward, elbows on his knees, breathing deep. You still want to learn? Mark nodded. Jake finally gave a small, broken smile. Then let's start now. The next morning felt different. Mark knocked on Jake's door, not barged in, not shouted through it. A soft knock, followed by a pause. You up? Jake opened the door, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Yeah. Mark held out 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Figured we could talk. Or not talk. Just be. Jake blinked. Hot chocolate. Mark smirked. Don't push it. They sat outside on the porch steps. The air was crisp, the sky a soft blue. Jake sipped his drink quietly. I don't know how to forgive everything. I don't expect you to, Mark said. But I want to earn my way back into your trust. One morning at a time. Jake glanced at him. You mean it? Mark nodded slowly. I promise. Jake looked down at his chipped sneakers. I've got stuff I'm dealing with. Things I've seen. Stuff you don't know. Mark placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Then tell me. When you're ready. They sat like that for a long time. No yelling. No lectures. Just the kind of quiet that heals. And for the first time in years, Jake didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. The next week brought small changes that felt big. Mark started waking up earlier, making breakfast, not just coffee and toast, but real breakfast. Eggs. Pancakes. Bacon on Saturdays. He didn't say much, but he was present. That was new. Jake noticed. Each morning, they'd sit at the table. No phones. No yelling. Just clumsy attempts at conversation. So, you still draw? Mark asked one day. Jake shrugged. A little. Mark leaned in. I'd like to see sometime. Jake looked at him for a moment, then gave a quiet, okay. That evening, Jake pulled out his sketchpad. Torn edges. Smudged corners. He handed it over like it was glass. Mark flipped through carefully. Street corners, faces, shadows, all drawn in raw emotion. These are amazing, Mark whispered. Jake looked surprised. You think so? Mark nodded slowly. They're honest. Like you. Jake's face softened. A door had opened, not wide, but wide enough. Just when things started to feel normal, the past came knocking. Jake was walking home from school when he saw Marcus, an older teen from the neighborhood, someone Jake used to hang around with when things at home were worse. Marcus had swagger, gold chains, loud energy. He was trouble. Yo, Jake, you ghosted on us, Marcus called, smirking. Jake hesitated. I've been busy. Marcus stepped closer. Don't forget who had your back when no one else did. You think that man of yours can fix what's already broken? Jake's jaw clenched. I'm not the same kid anymore. Marcus laughed. Sure, but don't forget, when it gets hard again, you know where home really is. Jake walked away, fists tight in his hoodie pocket, heart thudding. That night, Mark noticed the change in Jake. The quiet tension. The sideways glances. "You good?" Mark asked. Jake nodded too quickly. "Just tired." Mark didn't push, but he knew something was off. And in that moment, he realized rebuilding trust wasn't about one good week. It was about showing up when storms returned. Because storms always come back. Later that night, Jake sat on the floor in his room, back against the wall, sketchpad untouched. His mind kept replaying Marcus' words. That tone. That smirk. The way it pulled him backward like gravity. Down the hallway, Mark stood silently outside Jake's door. He could feel the weight through the walls, that unspoken heaviness parents sense without needing words. He tapped lightly. Jake opened the door a crack. "Hey," Mark said gently. "You sure you're okay?" Jake looked at him, eyes tired. "Yeah, just thinking." Mark nodded. "I'm here if that thinking turns into talking." He turned to walk away, but Jake's voice stopped him. "Did you ever have people try to drag you back?" Mark turned slowly. "All the time." Jake opened the door wider. "What did you do?" Mark exhaled. "Sometimes I failed. Slipped. Regretted it. But eventually, I stopped trying to be who they wanted me to be. Started becoming who I needed me to be." Jake looked down. "It's not that easy." Mark nodded. "No. But you're not alone anymore. That helps." Jake stepped back, letting Mark in. They sat on the bed in silence, not to fix anything, just to be together through the weight of it. Days passed, but the silence between Mark and Jake started to break, not with words, but with small gestures. One afternoon, Mark found Jake sitting on the fire escape, looking out over the neighborhood. He hesitated, then climbed up beside him. Jake didn't say much. Just stared at the city lights flickering on one by one. Mark broke the quiet. "You ever think about running away?" Jake's laugh was bitter. "Every day." Mark nodded. "Me too. But sometimes, staying is the hardest fight." Jake finally looked at him. "I don't know if I can do it." Mark placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think. You just need to believe it." Jake looked away, voice barely above a whisper. "Feels like I'm carrying the whole world." Mark smiled sadly. "Maybe, but you don't have to carry it alone." They sat there, side by side, the city buzzing around them, but for once, their world was quiet enough to hear hope. At school, Jake tried to blend in, but the weight he carried wasn't invisible. Teachers noticed his quietness. Friends noticed his silence. One day his best friend, Malik, approached him by their lockers. "You alright, man? You've been off lately." Jake forced a smile. "Just tired." Malik narrowed his eyes. "You can talk to me, you know." Jake hesitated. "It's complicated." Malik nodded. "I get it. But don't shut me out." That afternoon, Jake scribbled furiously in his notebook, pouring out emotions he couldn't say aloud. At home, Mark watched from a distance, respecting Jake's space but ready whenever Jake needed to open up. Sometimes, the toughest battles are the ones no one sees. Mark's phone rang late one night, an unknown number. He hesitated but answered. "Mark, it's Angela," said a woman's voice. Angela was Jake's school counselor. "We're worried about Jake. He's been withdrawing more, skipping classes. Has he talked to you about what's going on?" Mark's heart sank. "No, but I'm trying. I want to help." Angela's voice softened. "You're not alone in this. We can support both of you." After the call, Mark sat staring at the ceiling. The silence between him and Jake wasn't just distance anymore. It was a chasm they needed to cross. He knew trust was fragile, but he wasn't ready to give up. The tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake's grades were slipping, and his usual energy was replaced by silence and avoidance. Mark tried to reach out, but every attempt was met with walls. One afternoon, Mark came home early from work. The house was quiet, but Jake's room door was slammed shut. Mark knocked gently. "Jake, can we talk?" No answer. Mark sighed and sat on the steps outside Jake's door, the weight of years pressing down on him. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Jake stood there, eyes red, cheeks streaked with fresh tears. "I'm tired of pretending," Jake said quietly. Tired of trying to be someone I'm not. I don't want to fail. I don't want you to be disappointed. Mark's heart cracked. I'm not disappointed in you. I'm worried about you. I want to help, but I need you to let me in. Jake shook his head. You don't get it. You never did. Mark stood, swallowing the lump in his throat. Maybe I haven't, but I'm trying. And I'll keep trying. For you. Jake's defenses faltered for a moment, but then he turned and closed the door softly behind him. Mark sat back down, alone with his thoughts. The fight for Jake's trust was far from over, but he was ready to face it, one day, one moment at a time. Days slipped by in a blur of unspoken words. Mark kept trying, leaving small notes on Jake's bed, making his favorite meals, waiting patiently for an opening. But Jake remained distant, locked in his own world of silence and shadows. One evening, Mark found Jake staring at an old family photo album, fingers tracing the worn edges of pictures. A younger Mark and Jake, laughing in a sunlit park. Mark sat beside him quietly. Remember this day? Mark asked softly. Jake nodded, voice barely a whisper. You looked happy. I was, Mark admitted. Back then I thought I had all the answers. Now I know I don't. But I want to learn with you. Jake glanced at him, vulnerability flickering in his eyes. What if it's too late? Mark smiled gently. It's never too late to try. For a moment, the silence between them softened, replaced by something fragile, a thread of hope. The next morning, Jake surprised Mark by joining him for breakfast. They sat across the table, the silence between them less heavy this time. Mark looked up from his coffee. Hey kiddo. Want to tell me about school? Jake shrugged but smiled faintly. It's okay. Mark nodded. Just okay? Jake shrugged again. I guess. Mark chuckled. I'll take that as progress. They talked about small things. Homework, a new teacher, a funny moment in class. The conversation was simple, but to Mark, it was a breakthrough. Later that day, Mark found Jake sketching again, a drawing of the two of them, standing side by side, under a bright sun. Mark smiled, feeling the first real warmth in a long time. Sometimes healing wasn't about giant leaps. It was about fragile steps forward. Weeks passed, and slowly, the walls between Mark and Jake began to crumble. They still had hard days, moments of silence, frustration, and pain, but the space between them was no longer an empty chasm. One Saturday morning, Mark woke to the sound of footsteps outside his door. Jake stood there, holding a small, folded note. For you, Jake said, voice steady but soft. Mark unfolded it. Inside was a simple message. Thanks for not giving up on me. Mark's eyes filled with tears. He pulled Jake into a firm, long hug. We're in this together always, Mark whispered. Outside, the sun rose over their neighborhood, bright and hopeful. For Mark and Jake, a new dawn had come.